1811, the Peninsular War was in its third year. The Duke of Wellington and his Spanish and Portuguese allies had succeeded in throwing the French out of Portugal, but they were now faced with an even more daunting task. They had to find a way to strike at the French in Spain.
I put a quotation at the front of one of my books, Sharp's Company, that I later regretted. It seemed rather gratuitous. It came from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1. Now thou art come unto a feast of death. Yet it is apt, for now in 1812, if Wellington is to break out of Portugal, he must take the two great frontier fortresses of Spain, Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo. I'm standing where the Great Breach was made through the wall at Ciudad Rodrigo. In fact, on the cathedral over there you can still see the scars left by the British cannonballs that skimmed the wall, making the breach. And it was a dreadful breach. It wasn't really practical. It was so steep that some of the men who attacked up here abandoned their muskets and used their hands to get up to the top, where they fought with bare fists or using their bayonets as knives. It was murderous work. Yet Badajoz was to be worse. Much worse. Yet the Redcoats succeeded. Thanks to the brave men who got through this wall, Wellington is able to strike deep into the peninsula, even to Madrid itself. And some people thought when that city fell that the war was over. Well, it wasn't. The French are still too strong, and the British have to retreat back here to Ciudad Rodrigo. Yet the war is changing. Wellington can now march deep into the killing fields of Spain. In this episode, truly, thou art come unto a feast of death.
A shriek or a groan told that men were falling around me. Then the roar of the battle is hushed. The hurry of action is over. Look around. Behold thousands of slain, thousands of wounded, writhing with anguish, groaning with agony and despair.
He takes the French army apart, bit by bit by bit.
Suddenly, the battle is turning into a potential disaster. It was England's most dangerous hour.
It was hell. Hell in a very, very small place.
Except for a garrison at Almeida, the French had been thrown out of Portugal, but they were still in control of two vital positions on the Spanish-Portuguese border. These were at Badajoz to the south, and at Ciudad Rodrigo, 120 miles away to the north. It was, however, not just the British army that was occupying the minds of the French commanders and their troops. Urged on by Napoleon, they were bent on capturing such strongholds as Tarragona and Valencia, for only then could they put a stop to the militarized bands of armed civilians and bandit gangs that were making life miserable for the French. The guerrilla war in the peninsula saw both sides commit many unspeakable atrocities. French retaliation against the guerrillas was followed in turn by revenge attacks, which were followed by further retaliation, and so the vicious cycle of violence went on. This was the struggle that gave us the term guerrilla war. It means little war. It is often thought that the fighting was done by patriotic bands of armed civilians, but it was actually regular troops sent to fight behind enemy lines that were at the forefront of the struggle. There were also some bandits and deserters from the Spanish armies who found a new way to strike at their French foe. The fact was that wherever the French were in Spain, they were in danger of attack. Every occupied town had to be garrisoned. It was difficult to move around and exchange information. For the French troops, the effect was utterly debilitating. For the British, it was a different war. Following the retreat of the French from Lisbon, the cabinet had authorized Wellington to begin an offensive in Spain. rather than just defending Portugal.
The fortresses of Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo were massively important to Wellington and his campaign in the peninsula. Without their possession, you couldn't contemplate an invasion of Spain. It was as simple as that. Now, Rodrigo commanded the northern corridor, with Almeida being its twin on the Portuguese side. In the south, Badajoz commanded the corridor, the main Madrid to Lisbon road, with Elvas on the Portuguese side. Now, in June 1811, he besieged the southern fortress of Badajoz without any success whatsoever. He was given a bloody nose by the garrison there. He withdrew to a position on the River Caya, made sure he was in position for an attempt on Ciudad Rodrigo, which will come in the winter, January of 1812. But he really needed to take these two fortresses. He needed to take them. He could not afford to march into Spain and leave a garrison sitting on his communications with Portugal, so their possession was vital to his campaign.
Wellington had very little idea of siege operations. He had been successful in India, but he had actually taken a fortified city by storm. He'd been successful in Oporto. He had managed to convince the French that he was attacking from the west when he'd actually come in from the east. But Wellington did not have a siege train, certainly not one comparable to the siege trains which were available in Central Europe at this time. Wellington was very light in engineers, and so when Wellington came up against fortified cities like Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, there were really only two things he could do. One was to surround the city, besiege it, and hope to starve the enemy into submission. The other was to actually launch an assault, knowing that the assault would probably, almost certainly, lead to very heavy casualties.
Before he could attack, however, he had to clear the French from this place, Almeida, the only remaining French garrison in Portugal. In April 1811, Wellington, with his army of some 38,000 men, blockaded the border fortress, hoping to draw Massenar's larger army at nearby Ciudad Rodrigo away from the town and into battle on ground of his choosing. Wellington's preferred battleground was at Fuentes de Onoro on the Spanish side of the border, and it was here that the British commander prepared to stand and fight. Sure enough, in early May, Massenar began his march to come to the aid of the Almeida garrison. A battle was now inevitable. Although the British defensive position at Fuentes de Onoro was the best available, it was far from perfect, and by choosing it, Wellington had made a rather damning judgment of Massenar's tactical abilities. Remembering that the Marshal had been unable to think of a way to attack Busaco other than by a full frontal assault, Wellington gambled that he would repeat the same tactics here. Luckily for him, he was not to be disappointed. On the 3rd of May, Massenar hurled his troops, 14 battalions of them, at the village of Fuentes de Onoro. Despite their numerical advantage and heavy hand-to-hand fighting, the Frenchmen were thrown back time and again, and as night fell, the village was still in British hands.
It's May of 1811, spring, and the French are in Ciudad Rodrigo, and they're also in Almeida, which is, 4 or 5 miles over there. Marshal Massena decides he wants to relieve the French garrison in Almeida, and to do that he's got to get through Wellington's line, and this is the road that crosses the frontier. There's a stream here, it's the front line. The British are in the village up there. They're also guarding the plain way over there behind me, but let's forget that for the moment, because this is a very strange battle. It took place over 3 days. I mean, almost every other battle in the whole of the Peninsular War is a one-day battle. This is a 3-day battle. And it was brutal. This is hell in a very, very small place. What Massena does is he launches his men down this road, across, it wasn't a bridge then, it was a ford where I am, and up into the village. Now, the village is a maze, small alleys, narrow streets. And when you get in there, it's full of prime British troops, mostly light companies. What you have is a gasser fight. It's a brawl. It's a vicious brawl. This is not lines against columns. This is man against man, climbing up the hill. And Massena pulls more and more men in. But of course they start getting each other's weight. The alleys get clogged with dead. I mean, it is utterly horrific in there. They do actually get almost up to the church, and at that point Wellington launches a counterattack. It's one of the only few times he ever launched attacks in column, just poured them into the village. It's bayonet work, it's knife work. I mean, there's not time to reload. And finally the French do get pushed out. They make 2 or 3 attacks. But this is absolute horror. You have to imagine blood splashed up on the walls, men getting trapped in houses and getting bayoneted there. I mean, this was gutter work. It was absolutely horrible.
By midday, the town presented a shocking sight. Our Highlanders lay in heaps, and other regiments were scarcely less in the numbers of their slain. The French grenadiers, in their immense caps and gaudy plumes, were in piles of 20 or 30 together, some dead, others wounded, with barely strength sufficient to move. It was impossible for them to crawl out of the range of the deadly fire of grape and round shot that the enemy poured into the town. Great numbers perished in this way, and many others were pressed to death in the street.
After hitting a brick wall on the first day, Masséna spent the following day probing the British positions in more detail, searching for a weakness. He thought he found one, and the next day, the 5th of May, he launched a large attack against the open British right flank, south of Fuentes de Onoro. Here the exposed British 7th Division was nearly destroyed as it was engulfed by the French assault. With his entire flank in danger of collapse, Wellington dispatched the Light Division under the trusty Black Bob Crawford to save the situation.
On the second day, Masséna, realizing he's really not going to break through here, decides to turn Wellington's right. Now that is miles away out on the plain, out to a village called Picos de Miranda, which is well out of sight of here. And out there it's just a plain. Now why was Wellington there? Because this is obviously a much better defensive site. Well, Wellington's there because he's protecting his good roads back into the heart of Portugal. And he decides on the second day he can't defend those. Instead, he's going to concentrate on defending this road that leads to Almeida. But the 7th Division is stuck out there, surrounded by the French. The Light Division is sent out to save them, and it's one of the most magnificent pieces of British soldiering of the whole Peninsular War.
The Light Division, with the support of some cavalry, was outnumbered, perhaps 4 to 1, 5 to 1, by the advancing French. And the French came on as a combined group, infantry supported by cavalry and artillery. And the Light Division simply couldn't close the line. If it had, the cavalry would have cut it to pieces. And so the Light Division had to form into squares.
So you have to imagine the Light Division coming back across the plain, absolutely surrounded by French cavalry. I mean, there's dust everywhere, there's the gleam of sabres, the dragoons, long straight swords, the lances, but the French can do nothing.
Every time the French artillery unlimbered their guns to open fire at what would have been a sitting target, the cavalry, our cavalry, were in amongst them. And that was their great contribution to the day. The 1st Royal Dragoons, our Light Dragoons, were in there like a flash. So that's, their part in the retreat, the Light Division, should never be forgotten.
Napier, the famous British historian of the Peninsular War, said that it was England's most dangerous hour. And Wellington said it was a close-run thing. This was the origin of that famous phrase of Wellington's, which is usually attributed to him at Waterloo, but it actually comes from Fuentes de Onoro.
Well, they get safely back. And where does that get Masséna? Absolutely nowhere. He's still got to take this village if he's going to actually relieve Almeida. He can't do it. He makes one last effort on the 3rd day. It fails. And then what he does is he distributes the supplies that he's going to take to Almeida. He distributes them among his army, which is hungry anyway, and he goes back. Now that has not stopped the French from putting Fuentes de Onoro on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris as a victory. I mean, I can only think they have so few victories, they have to put a few defeats in there just to use up the space.
Strangely, even in the hell of Fuentes de Onoro, there was a camaraderie between the men of the opposing armies.
And there was a lovely story on the night after the battle, because the British are still in this village. You can imagine the village is horrid with wounded and dead. They haven't had time to clear it. The French have pulled back over the stream. They're up here, and they're about to go back to Ciudad Rodrigo. And Robert Crawford, the commander of the Light Division, is going round the pickets. It's dark now. It's dark. It's night. The fighting is all over. And he goes into I think it was a watermill. It was just down there. It's not there any longer. And the rifleman says, yes sir, everything's all right, sir. Everything's fine, sir. No trouble, sir. And Crawford sees there's a guy in the corner who hasn't stood up. Now, hang on. This is a major general, and the most frightening major general in the British Army. And this guy hasn't stood up. Who's that? Oh, he's all right. Who's that? And the guy stands up. He's a Frenchman. What's he doing here? We only came across for a light for his pipe, sir. Get rid of him! And it's a lovely story that this Frenchman had come across and said, I need a light. So they invited him in, gave him some wine, gave him a light for his pipe. But Crawford gets rid of him. It's a light finish to this awful, awful battle.
In terms of British battles, Fuentes de Honoro was the closest run thing of the Peninsular War. Wellington himself said it was the most difficult I have ever been concerned with, and not for the first time observed that had Boney been there, we should have been beat. His mood was hardly helped by the news that the French general at Almeida had somehow broken through the British blockade and escaped. I have never been so much distressed by any military event as by the escape of even a man of them, said Wellington, who was probably more pleased to learn that the French defeat had prompted Napoleon to relieve Masséna of his command. The savage fighting at Fuentes de Honoro was over, but ahead lay an even greater bloodbath at Albuera. While events at Fuentes de Honoro were unfolding, the Anglo-Portuguese force to the south under General Beresford, along with Spanish troops under Cuesta and Blake, were besieging the French at Badajoz. On the 15th of May, though, they received news that a large French army under Marshal Soult was on its way to relieve the beleaguered garrison. Wellington had foreseen that this was likely to happen, and had earlier advised Beresford that in the event of an attack by Soult, he should take up a defensive position near Albuera, a town some 14 miles from Badajoz. Unused to field command, however, Beresford panicked, and it was only through the intervention of General Castanos that he was persuaded to stand and fight. When the French actually attacked, Beresford froze while the chaos was made worse by the mistakes of some of his subordinates. In the end, it was only the courage of the ordinary British and Spanish soldiers that saved the day.
The Battle of Albuera on the 16th of May 1811 was a real bloodbath. It really was. On the morning of the battle, Beresford had arrayed his troops facing east, where they anticipated a French attack to come. But whilst the French were engaging the troops in the village on Beresford's front, the troops of Gazan and Girard came up from the south and began to try to roll up Beresford's right flank. Now, Blake's Spaniards were told by Beresford to realign themselves facing to the south, but he was still convinced that the attack was coming from the east, so he only sent 4 battalions of Zayas, who did a hell of a job. They did a really good job, the Spanish troops there, to hold up what was the largest single infantry attack of the Peninsular War. There were 8,000 infantry supported by cavalry and, more important, by artillery.
Beresford's Spanish allies are simply overwhelmed by this column. Beresford had actually ordered Spanish divisional commanders to actually reinforce the right flank. They had not obeyed these orders. And so suddenly the battle is turning into a potential disaster. British division, 4th division, moves forward and hits the left-hand side of the French column. It looks like it's going to be a classic line-over-column battle. The first few British volleys actually inflict terrible casualties on this great mass of Frenchmen. But then a storm breaks. It's one of these torrential downpours that you can get in the Spanish mountains in the summer. Powder was wet, and there were the British deployed in line.
All their muskets were immediately inoperative. More fatally to them, of course, was the fact that under this really torrential rainstorm was the fact that Polish lancers and French hussars came tearing round their right flank and just rode them down before they knew what had happened. And out of that 16,000 men, 1,300 of them were killed, wounded or taken prisoner. We then get the severe firefight, the real sort of stuff of legend. The 57th, for instance, the Middlesex Regiment, the Die Hard, it's where they got their reputation from, their nickname. The commanding officer, Inglis, struck down by a piece of grape shot in his breast, refused to be carried off the field and lie there chanting or shouting, Die Hard, 57th, Die Hard.
It goes on for nearly an hour, and the French outnumber the British 2 or 3 to 1, and the British line is gradually being worn down by the effect of French fire. Beresford has been watching this happen, but seems paralysed. He seems incapable of making a decision. And one of his subordinate commanders, Lowry Cole, that then moves up his 4th Division and smashes into the French flank, rolling it up.
And it was their attack, really, their contribution that really had the impact. Completely drove back the French after a really severe firefight. Ranks withering away because of French artillery fire, grape shot at close range, and as Napier said, nothing could stop that astonishing infantry. And as they drove the French back, as he said, they stood triumphant on that fatal hill. I mean, it was a tremendous achievement by them and by Houghton and Abercrombie to stay there fighting. Soult himself said, "The day was mine, but the English did not know it and wouldn't run." And that was, I still think, is one of the great compliments paid by a French commander to our troops. It may have been a bit backhanded, but nevertheless it spoke the truth.
Moyle Shearer, a young officer of the 34th Regiment, memorably captured the aftermath of the fighting at Albuera.
The slaughter was now dreadful. Every shot told. To describe my own feelings throughout this wild scene would be impossible. At intervals, a shriek or a groan told that men were falling around me. Then the roar of the battle is hushed. The hurry of action is over. Look around. Behold thousands of slain, thousands of wounded, writhing with anguish, groaning with agony and despair. Here lie 4 officers of the French 100th, all corpses. Most of the bodies are already stripped. Here again lie headless trunks and bodies, torn and struck by cannon shot. Such a death is sudden, horrid, but 'tis merciful.
Almost 6,000 Allied troops died during the fighting at Albuera. 7,000 Frenchmen were also killed. In all, almost half of Beresford's army was killed, wounded or captured. The British had won another victory, but at a fearful cost. Wellington, observing that another such battle would ruin us, was scarcely able to believe the casualty figures when they reached him. It was, perhaps, little wonder that as they were almost up to their ankles in the blood of their own dead and wounded, the British did not care to trumpet the victory at Albuera. The unfortunate Beresford was judged to be the villain of the piece, and was never allowed to hold an independent command again.
Under the pressure of command, he froze. He simply didn't react quickly enough to attempt to outflank his army. And finally, in the aftermath of the battle, the strain becomes obvious. It's quite clear that he suffered what we would call a nervous breakdown.
Amid the recriminations, it seemed to be almost forgotten that as costly as it had been, Beresford had won the battle, and Soult's army had been given a terrible mauling. Perhaps it was not surprising a renewed attempt to capture Badajoz had to be abandoned when the French again marched to relieve the city. And for the next 6 months, the Anglo-French army remained stuck on the frontier.
After the Battle of Albuera, Wellington arrived, and after getting over the initial shock, he was truly shocked at the battle and the casualties. In fact, he read Beresford's dispatch. He looked at it and he said it was so despondent, he flung it back at Beresford, and he said, "That won't do, write me down a victory."
And Wellington shortly afterwards transferred Beresford back to Portugal, where Beresford began training the Portuguese army. And he did an extremely good job of creating an army which was well enough trained to actually take its place in battle alongside the British army.
He then took himself back to Badajoz to prepare for what will be the second siege, the first siege being interrupted by the Battle of Albuera. The second siege was a disaster. Not a disaster, but a bad failure.
He simply wasn't strong enough. There were French armies in the field, and during the late summer and autumn of 1811, Wellington had to reluctantly abandon both sieges and went back into winter quarters.
Wellington began the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo on the 8th of January 1812. Siege warfare was not a popular pastime with the British troops, not least because it involved dangerous and laborious work. To make matters worse, during the siege at Ciudad Rodrigo, the weather was also terrible. So after only 10 days of laying siege, Wellington decided to storm the city walls. And it was the 3rd and Light Divisions that were entrusted with the task.
In the early 19th century, all major European powers had developed very effective systems for conducting sieges. It was the science of war, the art of conducting a siege. The one exception to this was the British Army. We had fewer engineers than any major European country, and we had as yet no dedicated soldiers to engineering duties. The engineering corps, for example, was entirely officers, and troops were simply taken from other duties, infantry troops, artillery, not very many cavalry, and then employed in siege duties. And it was extremely unpopular because it was very, very hard work. What the infantry had to do during a siege was to begin digging trenches. They're called saps, and they dug in a zigzag fashion towards the walls of the enemy fortifications. Now, artillery was employed in siege warfare in two ways. Indirect fire using howitzers, and the idea was to actually fire over the enemy's defences and demoralise him, keep him awake, and there was just a chance you might get lucky. You might actually hit that powder magazine and blow the whole thing sky high. But the more important use of artillery during a siege was indirect fire. You had your 18-pounders, your 24-pounders, and they would simply hammer away at a single point in the wall until they effected a breach. And at the point where the sap of the trench was within a reasonable distance, perhaps 300, even 200 yards from the breach, the assault would go in.
We always think of breaches as a hole in the wall. They're not. I mean, what the guns have done is the guns have collapsed the wall, and what's left is a pile of rubble, and it's a steep pile of rubble. This was an incredibly steep breach, the main breach here. So steep that most of the men couldn't, in fact, hold on to their muskets. They had to abandon their muskets, just went up there with bayonets. And when they got to the top, the French had put a mine there, which they blew up. It was a huge explosion. There was a lesser breach, which the Light Division attacked. This work was so awful, so murderous, that the first men into the breach were volunteers. I mean, you knew if you're going into a breach, you're going to die.
That is why their first troops to go for the breach were always called the Forlorn Hope.
It was a short but ferocious battle. The French defenders of Ciudad Rodrigo were pushed back into the town as the British stormed the breaches. When the fighting died down, Wellington had captured his gateway into Spain and had lost fewer than 600 men in the process.
Lieutenant Gurwood led the Forlorn Hope into the lesser breach, and he survived. An incredibly lucky man. I mean, one of the few men who actually survived being first into a breach. And Gurwood kept going through the town, and quite sensibly understood that the castle was probably the French headquarters. So he gets into the castle and in fact takes the surrender of the French commandant, and he eats the French commandant's supper, who's still hot on the table. But he gets up to the very top of the tower, and although it's night time, I mean, there must be enough light around because he wants to actually hoist a flag to say to the attackers, hey, we've taken the place, it's fallen. But he doesn't have a British flag with him, so he takes off his red jacket, ties it and runs it up the flagpole. So the red coat flies from the flagpole, and that's the sign that Ciudad Rodrigo has fallen.
However, there was one great loss to the British cause. During the storming of the walls, Black Bob Crawford, the man who had performed so brilliantly during the retreat from Corunna and at Fuentes de Honoro, was mortally wounded by a musket ball. A sad episode that was recorded by Lieutenant John Cook of the 43rd Light Infantry.
The French fought most desperately on the crest of the breach in the walls, throwing down large stones and missiles and keeping up a most deadly fire. Here, many brave officers and men fell. General Crawford received a mortal wound and fell into the aide-de-camp's arms while cheering on the main body of the division.
Black Bob Crawford lingered for days. Finally he died, and they buried him near the walls of Ciudad Rodrigo. The fighting for the tired Allied army, however, was far from over. The horrors of Badajoz were just a few weeks away. Wellington now turned his attention to the south and the formidable fortress of Badajoz. There was a garrison of 5,000 French troops within its walls. The British siege of the fortress began on the 24th of March, but once again, weather conditions were terrible and progress was slow. The picture changed in early April when Wellington received the news that the combined forces of Marshal Soult and Marshal Marmont were advancing towards Badajoz. With this large French army on its way, Wellington could no longer hope to sit outside the city walls and starve the garrison into surrender. Badajoz would have to be taken by storm.
So without having finished creating the breaches, without the trenches being anywhere near the wall, on the 6th of April, he orders the assault for that night.
Wellington had opened 3 breaches, and he launched his soldiers against those breaches at night. He also put in two feint attacks, which the most important one was the 3rd Division going up against the castle. Now remember, this is a feint attack. It's not supposed to succeed. All it's supposed to do is to hold the French defenders in the castle so they can't go down and reinforce the breaches. Well, it was a good thing they didn't, because the breaches were incredibly well defended. The French commander, Philippon, he was a smart guy, a good soldier, and he had those breaches impassable. They were filled with every kind of trap. I mean, they had mines in them. They had chevaux de frise. A chevaux de frise is the early 19th century equivalent of barbed wire. You take a huge log of wood, and then you stud it. Bayonets and blades, which one British officer the next day said they're razor sharp. You couldn't get through them. Even after the city had fallen, the British could not get through those breaches when there was nobody fighting them. And on the night itself, of course, they had cannons either side of the breach, the French did. They had a wall behind it, they had infantry. It was hell. Hell in a very small place.
Only one man got inside the breaches, and they found him dead the next day without his head, because he crawled beneath the chevaux de frise, and the French beat his brains in, and they staved in his skull until he literally had no head left. And there was 1 or 2 diarists who mentioned this.
So how did the city fall? It was that feint attack, the fake attack that was supposed to draw the French up to the castle to keep them from the breaches. Somehow those guys, with ladders, got across. It's an incredibly steep wall, a tall, high wall. Some of the ladders weren't long enough. I mean, they were actually trying to lift the ladders up. Others of the ladders were made of green wood. They split apart. But a man got over. And when the first man over, he killed a couple of Frenchmen, and the second man got over. And before they knew it, the castle had fallen. So then the British soldiers sweep down through the town, and of course they attack the breaches from behind. And at that point, another assault by the 5th Division got in at the other side of the town about that same time. So Badajoz falls.
5,000 troops were killed or wounded during the capture of Badajoz, almost a third of Wellington's army. The broken bodies of the fallen lay in great heaps around the breaches and the walls, and Wellington is said to have wept as he surveyed the carnage. The capture of Badajoz, he wrote, affords as strong an instance of the gallantry of our troops as has ever been displayed, but I hope I shall never again be the instrument of putting them to such a test as that to which they were put that night. There was also a dreadful postscript to the storming of the town. For once victory had been won, and the British troops were inside Badajoz, they embarked upon a frenzied orgy of drunken looting, rape and violence.
Some of the British soldiers claimed the Spanish civilians fire on them. The reality is that the British went on a rampage of looting. They got hold of huge quantities of alcohol. They got blind drunk, and then they proceeded to rape and murder on a scale which was without parallel in British military history.
And they've taken a lot of stick for that. And okay, we are 21st centuries away, have liberal sensibilities, and we know it's a bad thing to get into town and immediately set about raping and pillaging. But they thought about it somewhat differently. There was a convention in war that you offered a garrison a chance to surrender. If the garrison surrendered, they kept their lives, they'd probably be able to march away. They'd have to leave their guns here, but they would be able to march back to their lines. If they refused, because now you're forcing the besiegers to put their lives at risk to almost certain death. I mean, the casualties in sieges are much higher than casualties in battle. In those breaches, men are going to die in the scores. If you now force the attackers to go through that breach, the attackers are saying, you and everything inside that town is at our mercy. That's the convention. It's been going on for hundreds of years. It's only just at the beginning of the 19th century people are beginning to say this is really not a very good idea.
Bonaparte decreed, however, that none of his garrison commanders should surrender a fortress without sustaining at least one attack. The problem was, by sustaining one attack, the attacking troops would incur casualties that they would consider to be unnecessary. So hence, once you fought on, in effect you waived all rights to mercy, and under the laws of war, not that it happened, but they risked being put to the sword. Now when Rodrigo fell in 1812, apart from some Italians, the garrison got off scot-free. They were roughed up a wee bit, but they weren't slaughtered. This will give the defenders of Badajoz a lift, and they know that they can fight on and defend the place without fear of retribution. Now, in fact, years afterwards, Wellington wrote a letter saying that, if I'd have put the garrison of Rodrigo to the sword, I would have saved myself the flower of my army at Badajoz. And chillingly, he added, I say this to show that the slaughtering of a garrison is not a useless effusion of blood. You can imagine, therefore, that the garrison of Rodrigo is butchered. Those French troops defending Badajoz would have thought twice about fighting on when the breaches had been made.
The British officers were simply unable to restrain their men. Houses and even churches were plundered. Some shocked eyewitnesses reported that men, women and children were indiscriminately shot. Private Charles O'Neill of the 28th Regiment of Foot recorded what he had seen.
If there is one feature of war more repulsive than another, one from which every good heart shrinks back appalled, it is the scene that follows when permission is received to sack and plunder a city. All restraint is laid aside. Men's passions, wound up almost to frenzy by the maddening scenes through which they have passed, will have a vent. No sorrow is too holy, no place too sacred to shield its occupant from the storm. Many lost their lives in a vain attempt to check the cruelty, lust and drunkenness of their own soldiers. For 2 days and 2 nights, Badajoz resounded to the shrieks and piteous lamentations of her defenceless victims.
The sack goes on for 2 days and nights. It's not until a few are hanged in the marketplace that finally the looting and the plundering stops. There was one romance that started there. Think of the Boer War, think of the relief of Ladysmith. Well, who was Ladysmith? Ladysmith was the wife of Lord Smith, who was the Governor-General of South Africa. Who was Lord Smith? Well, he'd once been a rifle officer called Harry Smith. And the next morning, Harry Smith is picking his way through the breach. It was a terrible breach. There were about 1,500 bodies lying in the ditch outside one breach, and it steamed in the morning of the blood that had been spilt there. And coming out of the town are these 2 young girls, and neither, fortunately, had been raped. Juanita, who is the heroine of our story, had had her earrings ripped out of her ears. She's only 14. And Harry Smith takes one look at Juanita and falls madly in love at first sight. And eventually, Harry and Juanita marry. and they stay happily married. And Juanita, of course, is Ladysmith, and that's where the town of the Boer War gets its name, from Juanita, the 14-year-old who comes staggering out of Badajoz the morning after probably the worst night in the history of the British Army.
Wellington's capture of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz had a tremendous impact on the war. The whole of the French position was destabilised, and it was now open to Wellington to launch a thrust into the depths of Spain.
And so, Wellington, with an army of 48,000 men, entered Spain, and made for a town a little over 100 miles northwest of Madrid. Its name was Salamanca, and it was to be the scene of Wellington's greatest triumph of the Peninsular War. Up against Wellington this time was Marshal Auguste Marmont, the man who had been sent by Napoleon to replace the luckless Masséna, and for a time it looked like he might save the day. Having captured Salamanca, where a small French garrison had held out for some days in a group of fortified convents, Wellington attempted to advance deeper into Spain. But Marmont cleverly wrong-footed him by threatening his communications with Portugal, forcing Wellington to withdraw.
From mid-June till mid-July 1812, Wellington and Marmont were like a couple of fighting cocks. They manoeuvred to the north of Salamanca, then they headed back south. During all this time, the armies were usually in visual contact with each other. There has never been another time in military history when two armies have remained for such an extended period of time in visual contact. Indeed, on some occasions, as they marched across those dusty Spanish plains under that blazing summer sky, that they were within artillery range of each other. Now, it wasn't until the British and the French armies moved to the southwest of Salamanca that they moved into more broken ground. And it was there that Marmont lost contact with the British. And it was then that he began making mistakes.
It was mid-afternoon when an excited aide-de-camp interrupted Wellington as he sat down to eat for the first time that day. The aide-de-camp reported that the French army was on the move. Marmont was at last about to leave the door ajar, and the crucial battle of Salamanca was about to begin.
It was around the middle of the afternoon when Marmont began to overextend his troops. Don't forget, for the past few days, for a good week now, they've been marching side by side, and there was no reason for the French to think other than this was just another day's marching. So Marmont began to feed his men around, marching to the west, with Malcune's division leading. When Malcune got above the village of Los Arapiles, they stopped. The next French division, under Thomier's, continued going. They passed behind. And then they continued, and after a while, a gap of about the best part of a mile began to open up.
And Wellington sees this, and famously he's up on the Lesser Arapil Hill, and he's with his Spanish liaison officer, Miguel de Alava, and he's eating a cold chicken leg, and he takes a bite, he looks at the French, and he throws the chicken leg over his shoulder, and he says, "My dear Alava, Marmont is lost." And then, of course, he launches this thunderbolt attack from the right. Ed Pakenham leads in the 3rd Division.
Now they hit the French quite unexpectedly as they were still continuing their march. Thomier's, it was just another day to him. It was just a sunny afternoon. He was blissfully unaware that coming up on his right flank was some of the hardest fighters in Wellington's army, the 3rd Division. I mean, they were called the Fighting 3rd Division. All the great regiments, the Irish regiments, the Fusiliers, they were all there in that division. And Pakenham led his men, they brought up their right shoulders, came over the top, and there were the French on the Pico de Miranda.
As the British advanced out of the dead ground, they fired a murderous volley. Many British soldiers fell. And, in fact, the line recoiled. And General Pakenham had to rally the troops down on the road below us. But very soon they were reformed. They came up the hillside, which incidentally is very steep, and launched a terrifying bayonet charge, which drove the French willy-nilly along the ridge, back in the direction from which they had come. But meanwhile, Wellington had not been idle.
He takes the French army apart, bit by bit by bit, from their left and his right. General Clausel, who takes over from Marmont was injured very early on in the battle. He lost his arm to a British shell. General Clausel mounts a pretty good counterattack, which almost breaks through the British centre, but Wellington, as ever, is cool and calm, plugs the gap.
1,000 of Lamartine's heavy cavalry went around their right and finished the job. 8 battalions were destroyed. The centre of the French army was destroyed by Lamartine's heavy cavalry, and it was probably the greatest achievement by cavalry commanded by Wellington in the peninsula.
After the British had made their attack on the French positions, bitter fighting developed at 2 positions known as Arapil Grand and Arapil Chico that was to be vital to the outcome of the Battle of Salamanca.
But it all didn't go that well, because on the left of the 5th Division, the 4th Division under Lowry Cole had gone forward, and when the Portuguese on their left were driven back from the Greater Arapil, it left their left flank in mid-air with no protection. The French troops who were driven back to the Lesser Arapil came out, fired into the left flank of Cole, and began to drive him back. And Clausel suddenly had a chance to, if not to win the battle, certainly a chance to snatch a draw from it, and began to drive the 4th all the way back to the Lesser Arapil. So in many ways the 2 armies were turning round as the 3rd Division and the 5th Division drove in on the French left on Wellington's right, but Clausel was coming round in the centre. So both armies were kind of twisting round. Wellington, using his powers of foresight, somehow he'd allowed for this and had the 6th Division waiting there. The 6th Division moved forward and plugged the gap which had been left by the 4th and began slowly to drive the French back. And that was really where the tide turned. The French were then driven all the way back to a wood which lies to the south of the Salamanca battlefield. And it was a tremendous firefight on the Albuera proportions that opened up, that illuminated the night sky, because by now it's getting very dark. The French broke through the woods all the way back in the direction of Alba de Tormes, and as the darkness had fallen, Wellington gave orders that no pursuit was to be taking place. He also gave no orders for a pursuit, of course, because he knew quite well that Spanish troops under Carlos de España were holding the bridge over the Tormes at Alba de Tormes. But unknown to Wellington, Carlos de España had withdrawn these troops without permission. And I think he was so concerned and worried and frightened about telling Wellington, as I would have been, that he didn't. He kept quiet. And so when the French army turned up at Alba de Tormes, fully expecting to have a fight on their hands, they found the bridge deserted. They were able to make their getaway. And in some ways it took the shine, a bit of shine off of what was a tremendous victory for Wellington.
"7,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded during the fighting at Salamanca. Marshal Marmont, who had been so confident, perhaps overconfident, that Wellington could be defeated, was himself badly wounded by a British shell. Wellington had seen off yet another French general, and the British commander had decimated the French army. The road to Madrid was now open.
Salamanca. It was a great victory, an improvisation by a master of war. Yet if the Spanish threw away the immediate gains of the battle by their abandonment of Alba de Tormes, Wellington himself sacrificed the rest, because in the second half of 1812 he lost his usual sure touch. He once claimed that French strategy was like a fine leather harness. If it broke, it became useless. His own, he said, was made of rope. If that broke, he just tied a knot and kept going. Well, in the second half of 1812, the knots wouldn't hold. He struck north at the French lines of communication, but his siege of Burgos Castle was a failure. The worst scrape I was ever in, he admitted. Yet he survived, and the following year he went on to his most dazzling victory of the whole Peninsular War. Well, those great stories must wait for our next episode.